Welcome to the Garden Glen Science Podcast.
This is episode number 1, Reflecting on the Nature of Science. The goal of this podcast is to focus on how teachers can encourage students to develop science skills. While mention will be made of specific science content areas, these podcasts are designed to focus on science as a process instead of dealing with specific science content details. Many of the podcast episodes will include technology, engineering, and math concepts. I like the idea of STEM. Science does not act in a vacuum. Science uses math to explain the data from science experiments. Appropriate use of technology engages students and encourages their participation. Engineering involves combining science with art to design something. While my students are not specifically assigned engineering as part of our written state core, I can, however, engage them in solving problems using engineering ideas. Let me give you an example of engineering from my own science classroom. My state core asks that students understand how molecule motion differs between solids, liquids, and gases. Many teachers do this by direct instruction or by lecture. Teachers also have their students write notes to explain particle motion, and they may also have students diagram the motion of particles in solids, liquids, and gases. To involve more math and technology, I have my students put ice into a beaker, insert a temperature probe connected to a computer, and then place their beaker on a hot plate. Students observe the ice in their beaker and the corresponding data on the computer while heat changes their ice into liquid water and finally steam. To add engineering is as simple as challenging the students now to design something that can be put around the ice and still allow the probe to enter the area. Their goal is to make their ice stay the coldest the longest. Through this extension, students again recognize and have reinforced into them that ice, the solid state of water, does change into liquid water. Throughout each of these podcast episodes, I will encourage teachers to help their students gain knowledge by doing science. Examples of how students can do science include the following activities: observing, questioning, exploring, making and testing hypotheses, comparing predictions, evaluating data, and finally communicating conclusions. These activities cannot occur in classes that are focused on reading and/or lecture. Podcasts will also relate to the nets for students as much as possible. I try to include nets for students in the way that I plan labs and activities in the classroom. Mention will often be made of assessment, because assessment is vital to make sure that students are comprehending what they are learning in the classroom. Self-assessment is extremely important for all learners. I try to include opportunities for students to self-assess prior to doing an assessment that's either formative or summative in nature in my own classroom. I, for example, will recommend using the assessing projects for many of these activities and assessments. Performance-based testing is very important in science education. When students complete a lab, they are demonstrating their performance in that lab. I'm excited to share my love for science and students with you. I look forward to reviewing skills and attitudes that teachers can develop and help their students to gain. These are essential in science understanding. I hope that I can help teachers provide experiences that will help their students to comprehend science better. Quick review now of the terms that have been used in today's episode. Our podcast included the following terms: hypotheses. This is the plural of the word hypothesis that students may be familiar with. Commonly, this is used in science as an inference that's made when considering possible outcomes for an experiment. Observations. This term is about information that is obtained using the senses. Predictions. Inferences that have been made prior to doing experimental work. Data. Measurements that are obtained during experiments. I remind students that data should always be recorded accurately. Conclusion. Any inference made after gathering and evaluating data. A conclusion may extend the investigation by suggesting different ways or different variables that could be explored. This has been another Garden Glen Science Podcast, produced under a Creative Commons license. Remember that your students who actively are doing science will learn and love the subject.